Hi, welcome everybody who's coming in. We're gonna go ahead and get started a little bit after 7 just to allow everyone to come in. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We're gonna give it a few more minutes, then we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome to everybody who's just now joining us. Gonna give it a few more minutes for folks to join the Zoom, then we can go ahead and get started. I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. My name is Avery Smedley. I'm with the Youth Activism Project, and I'm also with another group that they house, Students Toward Equitable Public Schools. So I'm part of a larger activism work and larger advocacy, but education equity is really near and dear to my heart. So I feel so honored to be able to be your moderator today and lead this panel. I also think it's part of a much larger conversation that this nation is having as we're going through this racial reckoning. So I am so thankful to the audience and so thankful to our panelists. So be proud that you are part of something a lot larger than the Zoom. We're part of a larger conversation, and we're contributing a lot to how this nation is going to move forward. So before we go ahead and get started, I want to give a few housekeeping rules, so to speak. To ask questions to our panelists, you can enter things in the chat. For those of you who are on laptops or computers, you should be able to move your mouse down to the bottom, and you should see little icons on the bottom. One of them should say chat. If you're on your phone, I think it should be the same thing. And if you can't figure out how to do that, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask the question verbally. But just so that we're not talking over each other, it'd be great if we can try to stick to the chat. As you can also see in the chat, we've got the link for the YouTube if you want to watch it live on YouTube. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give them the floor to introduce themselves. I'm going to go just in order based on who's on my screen. Harmony, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope we have some really exciting, beautiful, difficult conversations today. My name is Harmony. I am a rising senior at USC. I'm currently studying, majoring in environmental studies, minoring in social entrepreneurship. I've been an organizer and member of Our Turn LA for a couple years now, and each time we jump into a new initiative and each time we're organizing, it's something new and different. And I'm so excited to continue to get to work with them and learn from other orgs and everybody else as well. And yeah, I'm really passionate about equity and justice for students. And since I'm an environmental major, I also do a lot of work centered in food justice and climate justice. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Des. Des, if you want to go next, I see you popped up on my screen. Seems like we might be having some difficulties. I'll go back to her. Alexis, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Alexis Campbell. I am from Georgia, so the South. I am a rising freshman at Spelman College, and I started to get involved in education reform the beginning of high school, and it's something that I've always been passionate about. Living in the South, there are so many disparities that are never addressed. And it led me to work with Student Voice. And I just absolutely love working with students. We're going to change the world. So, yeah. And I'm just so excited to have this critical conversation.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Karen? Oh, Karen, if you're trying to speak, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry.
We can hear you now.
After all these Zooms, can't get it straight here. I'm Karen Ishizuka, and I am so happy to be with all of you. I'm the chief curator of the Japanese American National Museum here in Los Angeles. And I'm here actually with one of our collection items that I wanted to point out. At first glance, it looks like the American flag, and sort of a symbol of patriotism, flag waving, but in reality, it's sort of an act of decolonization. Momo Nagano, who was a Nisei, was a young woman during World War II. And I think you all know that in World War II, the US was at war with Italy, Germany, who were massively incarcerated, 120,000 in 10 concentration camps around the country. Momo was in Manzanar here in California, and she worked in the camouflage. They were making camouflage nets for the US military. And ironically, it got her really interested in weaving. So she became a weaver. And so this is one of her pieces. So you can, I don't know if you can see it. Instead of the stars, it's the names of each of the 10 concentration camps. And in the white, in the stripes, she's put in names of the 197 families that were rousted from their homes on 30th Street, 30th Street Avenue. They called it the 30th Street area. So it's her way of commemorating not only her neighbors, but an entire community that was uprooted. So, I think it was something that really struck me as we are all redefining who an American is. before we used to think of an American as white heterosexual male, basically. But we're becoming a majority, minority, minority, majority, very soon. So whether people like it or not, as you can see by all you all who are here, it's great to see you all. And I just wanted to point that out as a way of introducing myself and my institution.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really powerful. I want to pass it off to Amina, our other panelist.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amina Salahu, and I'm from Syracuse, New York, and I'm a rising senior in high school. And I'm really excited to be here today having this conversation. One of the groups I'm involved in is called QZ BLM, and it was a group that started off with planning a protest after the George Floyd incident, and now it has become a whole organization. And I'm really proud to have a leadership role in that group. And right now, we are currently working on the removal of getting SROs removed in our schools. And so I'm really excited to be having this conversation. I think decolonizing curriculum is super important because that those are the steps that would be taken to help unroot racism, because how it's so institutionalized and such, where children as early in schools and stuff, that's where they're learning most of their information. So I definitely think this is so important. So yeah.
Thank you so much. We have such an excellent panel. It's so great to be here with all of you today. So I think for our first question, this is for everyone, but in the future, I may direct questions to specific people. I guess I'm wondering to our panelists, when was the first time that it was very apparent to you that our curriculum was colonized and very whitewashed?
I think I can go ahead and speak on this. So if this was not something that I realized until, I think, college. I think it took until college to realize that retrospectively, when I looked back at, like, the first thing that comes to mind is my elementary education. And the way that we learn about history, and particularly when it came to learning about missions. And I'm sure everybody can relate to, like, building missions, having kits, learning about it in schools as if, like, this is like how, there wasn't the word colonization. Like, I didn't hear that, I think, until late high school, early college. And it was something that, like, you were supposed to celebrate and you were supposed to, like, accept. And I was, like, really dumbfounded to look back and think, like, I visited missions, I made them, I built them. And little did I know this was torture and enslavement of indigenous peoples in California and all across the United States. There's ripple effects of that, and similar things happening in different states. And the education system, the way that it's taught, is the same throughout. And so it was really disappointing, but not surprising. And so, yeah, that's, like, the first thing that comes to mind, because I was really, really disappointed about that, and wish it was taught differently, obviously. Yeah, that's something that comes to mind.
I can answer the question next. So probably one of, like, the first major incidents during school that kind of really helped me specifically understand the concept of our curriculum being extremely whitewashed. I feel like it's something, going to a public school in the city, it's kind of something a lot of us have realized already before, being a school that's predominantly filled with minority students. So it's definitely something I've always realized, but definitely probably last year, me being a sophomore, this year being a junior, the first time I've ever really learned the truth about Christopher Columbus and such. So it's really, like, shocking. We've learned about it since elementary school, middle school, about, like, oh, Native Americans, like Christopher Columbus Day, that's something we should be happy to celebrate. We don't have school, like, something so great. So it's really, like, crazy. And I'm glad, though, that this year my teacher were able to really go in depth of who Christopher Columbus was and the real meaning of it. And it's just, like, so important. It really just shows, like, rather than students being able to hear the truth about their history and, like, their country, it's so whiteified where it has to be explained through lies and such. So yeah.
I can also speak to realizing in school how whitewashed our education is. So I originally came from a county K-7 that was more diverse in the county that I eventually moved into later my 7th grade year. And it wasn't that I noticed the differences immediately, but I could tell that things were being taught in a different manner. And when I got to the 9th grade, when we were learning about so many events that almost ended in genocide throughout history, it was a lack of empathy or caring that the teachers had towards what we were learning, and talking as if these people throughout history weren't human, made me realize that there is a disconnect between how we're viewing all different races throughout history and how colonization has completely changed the way children are learning this history. And so I think the turning point was I was in 11th grade and my teacher danced around the class, mocking Black people who were enslaved in America. And I was just so shocked that it was so normalized to have such an attitude towards these behaviors and being made fun of for speaking up. I realized that our curriculum is whitewashed in a way that even the kids that are learning don't really understand, because we're indoctrinated from an early age to just accept it without critically thinking about how we got to where we are as far as history.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a like a lot of you, and I wish that things would have gotten better since I was in school. I think a lot of it is that we didn't see ourselves reflected in the history books, in the educational films, in the media. You'd think that if you just saw what was presented to you, you'd think that all of the United States was white. I think, bringing up my experience again, with the incarceration during World War II, I have had many friends who had, because I was taught about it, and I don't know if it's still not taught in school. Taught. But when the opportunity arose, many of my friends, when they said, their parents went to a camp and had to go to a place, their teachers just basically said, that's a lie. That didn't happen. So, that sets up, so much, right? You're called a liar by your teacher, the authority figure. You think, well, am I? Am my parents? Were they mistaken? So it sets up an entirely snowballs that kind of lasts for a while in terms of your own self, but it really calls up the need for all this decolonization.
Thank you so much for sharing. Those stories are so disheartening. And I think it really exemplifies how much we need to change our curriculum. And it leads me actually into my next question. I'm wondering how all of you as women of color, how not seeing yourself in curriculum and not seeing your history, how is that detrimental to you and other people of color?
So I know that as far as history goes, and being representative of everybody, that as a Black American, when we learn about Black Americans in America, the only thing that is taught is slavery. It's very, very dehumanizing. And from an early age, that's kind of where my peers and I started to disconnect with education. When you are not being taught an education that is specifically tailored to your experiences as a person and your identity, then you're less likely to want to pay attention. And I've seen so many of my peers disengage because teachers didn't care to show us how we were seen throughout history. A lot of people think of slavery as groups of people just being brought over to a certain place, but forget that they had lives before they were enslaved. Their identities are not just tied to being a slave. Their identities go much farther than what America teaches. And I know personally that I saw my identity as not as important in history growing up, because a lot of the things that were taught is white saviorism. And so eventually it became normal to just see white people as the most powerful people in society, not recognizing that there are so many other ethnicities and races that have completely changed the way we view history, and have led to so many great things in society.
Thank you, Alexis. And I meant to share an anecdote along with my question. I also wanted to add that me being a Black woman myself and not seeing myself in history, I know for me, it kind of perpetuated the stereotype and the myth, oh, Black people are just lazy. Like, why haven't we been able to like lift ourselves since slavery? Because I didn't learn about redlining and I didn't learn about de facto segregation and about how the government like allowed disinvestment in those neighborhoods. So I think it's like a two-pronged thing where like not, as you said, Alexis, like not seeing yourself represented, it makes you want to disengage, but also it kind of perpetuates like those myths and those stereotypes. But I want to open the floor up to other panelists too.
Yeah, I can answer the question next. Yeah, not seeing myself in history or people who look like me in a positive way, I guess, definitely has been detrimental. But so I'm glad to be able to have parents I can look up to who are successful, but not every child of or student of color has that. And I think it's like, it just frustrates me because the whole concept of teaching is like you want to teach students and young adults so they can eventually become like productive members of their society. And when students aren't able to see themselves or see a future for themselves through school, then it kind of just like what do you expect them to do once they're older? Then they don't see people who look like them as leaders. They don't see them or learn about them as like scientists, people who are powerful, people who are smart through school. And those students who do see people of color doing such great things, it's them kind of like hearing an article about it or learning it outside of school or such. I don't know, I just feel like with school being such a place students are all the time, them, especially students of color, being able to see themselves, learn about people who look like them, would definitely be able to empower them more to want to just see a future for themselves and give them the ability to feel like they're important and that they have the ability to do such great things as the white people they are taught about in history.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I definitely have similar experiences. Alexis said something really important that stuck with me about not seeing it there and therefore thinking it was unimportant. And then because of that, there was no self-motivation for me to figure it out myself, because I just thought, well, if it was important, it would be there. It would be something we'd read. It would be literature that we were well versed in. It would be things that our teachers would talk about. So it must not be something enough for me to look into. And so I didn't for a really long time. And as we all know, our history books are very Eurocentric and teach one specific narrative that's really detrimental to peoples of color. And when I did see it represented, it was oftentimes in this light of like assimilation and honoring and congratulating people like me who were doing good because they assimilated, because they were conforming. And so it builds this idea in your mind: if I'm not conforming or assimilating, therefore I also must not be important. And so that's something that I understood, that like my parents and my dad in particular, because his mom immigrated to the United States when she was really young. She had like a third grade education and figured it out. And they were raised in the projects of East LA, and we still live here in East LA right now. But it for him, it was like, I assimilate and survive, or I don't make it out of here alive, kind of thing. So that carries on, that trickles down through generations, and it is intergenerational trauma. But that can be combated with good education, with books, with guidance, with support, and history books that are representative of us, with authors and scholars who understand our histories. So yeah.
Yeah, Harmony, that was really, yeah, very powerful. I think, the whole concept of assimilation is something that is so, it's so unconscious in all of us. And then the flip side of that is, when I was in elementary school, especially, I think for people of color and people of color, immigrants of color, the only way we were presented was as International Day, so that we were forever foreign. They would ask us to come in our dress or bring foods, and which is good, but the idea was you're othered, you're not an American. Somehow you're the only value that you have is with these exotic food or dress. So it's difficult then to maintain sort of a racial and cultural pride when you're trying so hard to be white in order to be American, because that's the definition of American. So, I think that whole concept of assimilation is, really, really important in all y'all's efforts to decolonize in the schools right now.
Thank you everybody so much for sharing. That leads me into my next question. I also am curious to see how you all think a colonized education hurts white children as well.
That's a really great question. I'm really glad you asked that. I think that if there isn't representation, like we talked about, it kind of leads to this, at least from my perspective, I would think that it would lead to this, like, well, I didn't read about it, and so therefore I'm not well informed, and maybe it leads to the that I don't see color thing, because it wasn't well represented. And it's kind of like, yeah, why would you see it? Why would you acknowledge it if you didn't learn about it? But obviously, like many of us understand well, is that if it's taught to everybody, then everybody has a good understanding. Learning about different histories isn't supposed to just be for people of color. It is for everybody to learn and understand, so that we can have empathy for each other, so that we can learn how to best support one another. If I know your struggles and your history, I can show up and be there for you that much more. And that goes for everybody, especially and including white people as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that a decolonized education does harm, how it harms white people, is their feeling of entitlement, of feeling that they are entitled and they are privileged. You know, and sort of the flip side of that is, you know, when they realize, you know, they are, you know, one amongst many people, and that there are several other and lots of other people besides them, you know, there's this feeling of white fragility then. You know, I think, you know, one thing of growing up as Black, Indigenous, and people of color is that you learn to struggle, and you learn to, and it strengthens you in many ways. That is hurtful, but if you can flip it so that you realize that it does strengthen you. So I think that that's when you see, you know, this white concept of white fragility, and when you know, and that's, you know, a way to answer the question, a way that I think a decolonized education really harms white people.
I didn't even think of it that way. Thank you so much for that added perspective.
Yeah, I definitely kind of like to voice what two panelists just said. I definitely agree with that. Kind of with the concept of just like decolonizing curriculum and education. It definitely isn't just about benefiting students of color, but yeah, that's a great question. It also harms white students as well as students of color. But yeah, so definitely in the way of like, it harms them in the sense of where it causes them to grow up and like be in a sense like ignorant, kind of with the whole sense of like being entitled and feeling as if like, oh, it's just them and everyone else is around them and it's just white people, everyone else's cultures and everyone else's beliefs are just there. So yeah, I definitely think it harms them in the way of just them not being well-rounded and not understanding other people's education. And especially a lot of white students who genuinely care and are want to be like active parts of Lives Matter movement, but a lot of them just kind of feel in the sense where they feel like they're not able to really help that well because they don't understand or the cultures of people of color. So definitely that's a great way where it harms them because them just not having the understanding of everyone else's culture.
Yeah, I definitely agree. From my own experiences, I've seen that implicit bias isn't really talked about in schools and the curriculum, and decolonizing the curriculum would make white students think critically in a way that they haven't thought before, because a lot of people think that racism is very out there ways to express hate, and racism is very subtle in certain ways. Microaggressions take place in school all the time, and that is a form of racism that a lot of people don't pick up on. And so these microaggressions that they have committed probably their entire schooling, is now going to come into question and how they think about their own identities. And so it's something that has to be done in a very intentional way to make sure that the needs of everybody are being met, because when you're decolonizing curriculum, you have to remember that it's not about just decolonizing curriculum, but you have to make sure that you have a goal in mind. And if your goal is to inform, then you have to make sure that that's what you're doing without being harmful, because a lot of people are very harmful when they try to inform others.
Thank you so much for that. As we're moving forward, just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to ask that maybe one or two people, if a question really speaks to you, if you can answer it, but not give the question to everyone, just so that we can get through everything. I'm really glad that we have so many great questions in the chat. I think I'm going to prioritize the questions from Zoom because those were first. So somebody asked in the Zoom like registration, how can we decolonize curriculum specifically for STEM and particularly in math? So I'll give that to like a few panelists who really want to answer. Maybe Harmony could take this one.
Yeah. So I would say I'm kind of in STEM. I do environmental science, environmental studies. And the first thing that comes to mind with that is I've felt that my environmental studies curriculum and this is in college level because it wasn't accessible before that, but it does still apply, is that it just is very clinical and it's very like scholarly and text-based, and we only learn about it when it comes to like sustainability and zero waste maybe, and a lot of the environmental racism aspects or how it leads to food justice or food apartheid, and things that are intrinsically related to race and socioeconomic status. A lot of that gets brushed under this topic of like, okay, we're going to learn about it from a very critical standpoint, and we're going to talk about CO2 levels and carbon sequestration, but we're not going to talk about how redlining has impacted communities or how Indigenous people on the front lines are experiencing more water and air pollution than affluent white communities. This is like, this conversation, it blows my mind that this conversation isn't being had in ivory towers, in white bubbles, in institutions with a lot of power and a lot of money, and it really frustrates me. I'm going into my 4th year now, and we had this conversation maybe one time in one lecture, and outside of that, I've been having these conversations with many people outside of schools, and people get it, but institutions don't seem to want to acknowledge it as much. And so from my perspective in my bubble, from where I'm coming from, I see decolonizing curriculum in spaces like that, in science like that, where we talk about accessibility and we talk about disenfranchisement of communities of color, because it generally, we're kind of like, oh, really? Those people face those issues? That must be a coincidence. That's not accurate, obviously. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and that's what I would say from my perspective.
So well said. Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to take this question before we move on to another one? Okay, great. Another person in the Zoom registration asked, where else can you go to get a more anti-racist education? What's available outside of school and curricula channels?
You know, I want to tie that into one of the comments in the chat where the question was how to capitalize now in this era of remote learning to develop decolonized curriculum. So, you know, I think that, you know, we're dealing with a demand number 7, but, you know, demand number 10 of y'all's is to invest in community partnerships bolstered by robust infrastructures in surrounding communities. So, you know, I would really say to reach out to educational, cultural institutions like the Japanese American National Museum and other institutions that are in your area, because I think that that is at this time, especially, we have a really wonderful education department, really sensitive, and they're reaching out, but we're also doing a lot of online programs now. And that's, you know, open for people to jump on. And I think that other institutions would as well. So that's a way to broaden the anti-racist education.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd bring the perspective of museums, so I'm glad that you took that one. Anybody else want to answer that question before we move on? Great. I think I'm going to combine two of the questions from the Zoom. So McKeetsley asked, what can we do to be able to implement new curriculum within the next year or two? And Haley asked, how do you win over people when you're in a very conservative school? So I think I'd like to combine the two and just ask, how can we push for decolonized curriculum? And what especially should we do if we're in an environment that's not so welcoming to decolonizing curriculum?
I can take this question. I definitely feel probably like the biggest way to those people who want to implement that in the school is definitely explaining why. So like whether that's talking to administration or even teachers to get their support, it's like whether it's like forming some sort of like presentation or something, but definitely explaining the why. Because if a school is not for that, it's definitely because they're blind to the injustices that other students are facing because it doesn't affect them. So definitely just being able to explain, because that kind of goes with something like talked about before, like why, how this also harms white students. So a lot of these students probably don't even realize or see how the education and the curriculum is affecting so many students of color. I definitely think kind of just emphasizing the important and showing your school administration, like teachers, why this matters and why it's important.
For sure. And shout out to Shukri. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but they brought up an excellent point. They said that we are all global citizens, so it's like so vital for them to learn like the history of people of color because like we're moving towards a more diverse society and a more diverse like globally and nationally. So thank you so much, Shukri. Excellent point. Does anybody else want to add to this question before we move on? Great. So those are all the questions we had from the Zoom. I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions in the chat just in order. Hopefully, we should be able to get to every one of them. Everett asked, do you believe that the horrific history of the treatment of people of color is watered down in order to minimize anger within minority groups? And I guess you can also answer, do you think it's watered down to minimize anger for like white people as well?
I do. I think,
Sorry, go ahead.
okay, sorry. I think that there is a tendency to water it down because I think everyone's afraid of hard questions and hard discussions. And I think that people are, especially adults, don't think that kids can handle hard discussions. You know, I think that in a way they're trying to shelter them, and you know they're doing just the opposite. But I do think that you know there is a tendency to make everything you know nice and let's all get along, and you know why do we have to talk about this, and let the past be the past. And you know I think that's really really not the right thing to do. Harmony, I stepped over you there.
No worries. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would say part of it has to do with the United States in general not wanting to take responsibility for their actions historically. And I think that's because responsibility means reparations. Responsibility means that we now hold ourselves accountable, and we have to like have inclusivity and affirmative action. You know, these are all steps that it's easier to just be like, that was the past. I don't have to be responsible for that. But as I've heard many other great activists, people on the front lines, people of color mention time and time again is how if you benefit from or upholding an old system, then you still have to acknowledge it and take responsibility for it. And that's just something that the US seems really unwilling to do.
Thank you so much. I want Dora to know that I acknowledge her question, and I think I'll be able to answer your question speaking to how do we help students that don't necessarily have the resources but want to decolonize. I'm going to speak to that at the end. The Education Justice Collective, Move School Forward, they've put together this really great, really comprehensive packet about all these different ways that you can support the decolonization of curriculums within your schools. So I'll definitely talk about that at the end. And I think Karen already addressed the idea about how can we use like virtual classrooms to develop decolonizing curriculum. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to Ken's question. He asked, what would a decolonized curriculum look like? And what do the panelists see as models for a decolonized curriculum?
I can answer this question. And okay, so definitely okay, so I definitely kind of back to things I mentioned before, more of inclusiveness is to me what a decolonized curriculum looks like. That doesn't mean not teaching students about Europe and like Eurocentric things, but it definitely means, it means like not just like adding to curriculum, but being more inclusive. So like at my school, not everyone's lucky to have a history teacher that cares and understands like this whole concept, but my history teacher has voiced many times how curriculum is very white-based and how it's not fair to the majority of students in the school who are students of color who don't learn about their history. Like, for example, and someone in the chat who mentioned kind of like explaining the why isn't enough or such, it kind of like goes back to the how the only time a lot of students of color learn about themselves is during Black History Month. It's only like a little bit of information, and a lot of that time it's kind of just learning about the negative things. Like Black History Month shouldn't be always just about the civil rights movement. There's so many other things that happen, and just like teachers thinking about that stuff, being mindful of that, including more things in the curriculum. Like for instance, my teacher, my history teacher, something he was trying to implement in our school, but due to COVID and like not having that planning time, he wanted to have an African American studies class, whether that means it's an elective or an after school thing. He said whether it can even be like an actual class where you get credits, but at least like having that option in schools, like having some sort of like, even if it's like a club where it's led by some teacher and it's like discussion based, like just having that option. So yeah, especially for schools that some people in the chat said their school is very like conservative and that's just something that might not be able to happen. It doesn't have to be like completely changing your whole curriculum because that is like, some of that is tied with New York State. It's not that easy to do, but also like the steps to be going towards that could be just even like shining light and like for Black History, whether it's like holding discussions and dialogue and like doing things like that.
Thank you so much. And if I can just add to that, Howard Zinn wrote like one singular book encompassing so many different experiences. Like it's really not that difficult. Does anybody else want to take that question before we move on?
Yeah, actually, just adding on to that, we've been discussing in our turn with a collective of exactly this conversation of how do we get LAUSD or how do we get the new candidates who are running for Board District 3 and 7 to champion these initiatives, and one of them being culturally relevant pedagogy and a decolonized curriculum. And we were discussing how difficult it is to get a district to completely bring in new books and new literature and to rewrite it, all the money that goes into that. And so something we were talking about is exactly what you mentioned, Avery, of like, maybe that means the first step is you just include more books with more perspectives. And I think you were talking about a people's history of the United States, right? And so that's exactly that, or Indigenous people's perspective, and have inclusivity where they're not going to tell you we have to completely restructure and erase and put all this money in. And it's like, no, it doesn't have to be that hard. Step one can be this. So that's what I would say. And those are conversations that we've been having recently.
Absolutely. I know in my school, my English teacher, she just like pulled like a few like sections from that book. So I think, and our teachers are showing us too that like they have the will. It's just like everybody else has to catch up. And yeah. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Cindy asked, basically, I'm just going to summarize. Can you all explain what is the issue behind white people saying they don't see color and like what's problematic about that?
So I can take this question. Um, I I think that within the discussion of decolonizing curriculum, literature, all of those things, we have to examine intention versus impact. It is always intent versus impact. So we all usually have good intentions, but if your impact is harmful, then it doesn't matter your intentions because you made an impact that was negative, and those impacts you can't take back. No matter what you learn afterwards, you still made that impact on that person. They still have that experience that they're going to carry with them. And living in a predominantly white county, and even in the middle school that I went to, teachers would be racist to the students in a very subtle manner. And the things were along the lines of, I don't see color. And if you don't see color, then you're not acknowledging that that color is going to determine my experiences no matter where I am. And I think a conversation needs to be had on that type of microaggression, because students and teachers get caught up in people thinking that they're saying that their intentions were harmful, and that's not the case. But in order to explain that, you have to be able to first realize that there was a problem with you saying that to begin with, because when they're saying that and you acknowledge that what was said was wrong, nobody wants to listen past being wrong. And so being able to lay out that you have a right to protect your frame of mind, your person, and that you don't owe somebody an explanation for that. I think that a lot of people think that the things that we're taught are all supposed to come from school, but sometimes you have to be going the extra steps to educate yourself, especially when you put yourself in that position to commit microaggressions like that.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm just going to take one more question. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I'm thinking maybe if it's okay with the panelists, once we do this last question, give concluding remarks, maybe we can circle back and answer a few more questions, because I think I just see like two more, if that's okay with everybody. But the last question for now, Brennan Lewis asked, I'm curious how folks think decolonizing education and learning overlaps with public policy and frameworks around schooling, i.e. Common Core and national testing standards.
You know, in terms of connecting policy, you know, I'm reminded of Ibram Kendi, you know, his book Stamped, the history of racist ideas. You know, he brought up something that was, to me, really interesting and, you know, worthy of a lot of thought, is that he's saying that racist ideas did not come first. It was racist policies. And the ideas came afterwards to support those policies. So, you know, I think that, you know, in terms of the question is, you know, really something to think about, keep in mind, and realize how they are connected in very vital ways that are affecting all of our lives every day.
Does anybody else want to take this question before we go ahead and give our concluding remarks? Cool. So yeah, if the panelists just want to say like any final words to the audience about like anti-racism or decolonizing the curriculum.
I think I'd really like to share a big thank you to Karen for bringing in a new perspective, for opening up all of our eyes. As a different generation, we're not often aware of lived experiences of other cultures, races, and generations. So thank you so much for supporting and for, sorry, my dog's like barking. Yeah, thank you just so much for being here with us. I really appreciate it. And everybody who tuned in. I don't know everything. I was telling Des that I felt underprepared to speak on these topics, and I felt unconfident about it. But it's my lived experience, and I need to just have confidence in what I'm saying and own it, and also not only speak up about it, but listen to others. So I'm really been thankful to hear from the other panelists as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to take that as an introduction to go next. Thank you, Harmony. Yeah, I think that, we all need allies, and we are all in this together. And it's an intergenerational fight. And I think that all of our efforts should definitely be intergenerational. As we all stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. And there is a lot of legacy and history of protest, especially student protest. So, as I look to all you all, because you really are my future and salvation, I think that you can't be expected to do it all alone and everything all by yourselves. I think too, to remember that you're not going to be able to change everyone. You're not going to be able to change Trump and his supporters, no matter how much you work and how, because there's an underlying, anyway, don't get me started on that. But I think, besides the effort to change and to decolonize, to also strengthen yourselves. And I think that's what you all are doing now here. And I think that's going to take you a long way. You need to strengthen yourselves, each other, support each other, learn from each other. And I think, it's only by doing so that we'll go forward. Thank you. Also, I am just so honored to be here, really. I am the OG on the panel, and I am so pleased and so proud, and yeah, so honored really to be here. Thank you so much for asking me, Student Voice.
We are so honored to have you. Thank you.
I just want to say that I absolutely love having these conversations. It is hard to unlearn sometimes, and it's something that I am constantly doing, to be aware of things that I'm contributing to that are negative and that impact people in harmful ways. So it's incredibly important for advocates and activists everywhere to keep unlearning and relearning. And so this experience has been a learning experience for me too. I don't know everything, and I am always open to hearing different perspectives. So I am glad that I got to be a panelist.
Yeah, I second what everyone said. Of course, like a huge thank you and for Student Voices for organizing this. And but yeah, I think it was nice to be able to have this conversation, hear the different perspectives of the panelists, hear the different questions, just kind of see how people feel and think about this. So yeah, thank you. And I'm really glad I was able to be a panelist.
So I will just finish by saying thank you so much. It's been an honor having you all. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your words. This has been really great. This hour went by so quickly for me. This has been super enlightening, super enriching conversation. I don't want to leave you all with just this though. This was the beginning. We're having a conversation, but we also have to move forward and follow up with actions. So I think Taylor has put a link in the chat to our resource guide. It's amazing. It's super comprehensive. I think I kind of alluded to this with Dora's question, but if you want to know how to move forward and how to get these demands in your community and decolonize your curriculum, but you're not so sure how, please check out that doc. It's super comprehensive. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to Student Voice, Move School Forward, etc. I can put the handles like in the chat. And I think they have a email as well. But that's just like their Instagram handle. So you can DM them anytime. Yeah. And then Emmy put Move School Forward. So if it's okay with the panelists, I wanted to like be respectful of everyone's time for those who had to leave like right at 8. But would you all be interested in answering just like, I think there were 2 more questions. Cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for your flexibility. These are such great questions, and I wanted to see if we could answer more of them. Let's see. The other question that I saw was, Jessica asked, what role do you think BIPOC joy and excellence plays in decolonizing curriculum?
Can you repeat the question, Avery?
Sure. So Jessica asked, what role do you think BIPOC joy and excellence plays in decolonizing curriculum?
Oh, our joy and excellence, right?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that one.
I think that BIPOC joy and excellence is extremely important to decolonizing curriculum and becoming more inclusive and diverse. I am a musician, so I absolutely love music, no matter what type of music it is. And I remember learning about Florence Price for the first time in music this past year. And I was absolutely like, the joy that I got from hearing about her was something that I hadn't experienced in a long time. And I think being able to bring in more excellence from everybody will help students to see that they are valued and that they have what it takes to become a powerhouse in the world. I get so excited to hear about Indigenous culture. I think it's so important. We're on their land, and they've done so much for the US that's never acknowledged, and hearing about how beautiful their culture is and to have that included, I think would stop the perpetuating of harmful stereotypes that I've heard throughout school. So I think that it just helps people to keep an open mind that BIPOC are as talented, gifted, outspoken, intelligent as everybody else across the world.
I'll just quickly say that I think when we only learn about our struggles, it could lead to just piling on traumas. But if we can center also joy and excellence, then we can learn about our feats and things that we've been champions in. And for personal or for community supports to thrive, you have to also be well versed in 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 the wins, in the feats. And I get super excited to learn about BIPOC or BIPOC excellence. Like I just get so inspired by it, and I'm like, it just helps to motivate me to move forward more, and I would love to see that centered.
What an excellent note to end on. Does anybody else want to add before we like close out for real? Great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who came, each and every one of you panelists. You all have been absolutely brilliant. It's been so great having you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm looking forward to more moving forward in our next town hall. Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your nights. Bye. Oh, and to answer Chris's question, this is on YouTube. Okay, bye. Thanks.